Good evening, everyone. Before crossing into the uncertain terrain of foreign policy under the Trump administration, terrain that at this point is necessarily thicker with questions than with answers, I'd like to back up and talk a little bit about the November 8th election itself and what it tells us and how I think we're best advised to respond to it. The Monday following the election, I was at the AJC Berlin office for a special transatlantic roundtable explaining our election to 25 very serious and very worried German diplomats, think tank analysts, and journalists. I walked them through the reasons as I saw them for this surprising historic election, and I said that whatever our concerns are about the outcome, about the unpredictability ahead, particularly in the realm of transatlantic security, as well as in other foreign affairs matters, AJC would continue in our tradition of engaging the new administration, engaging the new Congress, working closely with our friends around the world and with civil society partners at home, and safeguarding our values and our interests. I've had different versions of that same conversation many times in the last 4 weeks. I suspect that many people in this sanctuary have had them as well. Explaining the November 8th outcome to my German listeners and, frankly, to myself, I spoke in Berlin of America's uneven recovery from the Great Recession, the different Americas that have emerged with whole sections of the country and large blocks of ethnic and class and educational cohorts seeming to view the world and their options in such starkly different ways. I spoke of the paralysis in Washington, and the explosion of social media with fake news deepening already deep anxieties and awakening a hunger for radical change. And I spoke of the sense that America isn't leading the world, isn't respected and feared in the way that we remember or think we remember from times past. And I spoke about the looming threat of terrorism, which further weakens confidence in the political status quo and the common perception of a country flooded by undocumented migrants, and the fears that were so nakedly stirred up in response to that perception. I told my German audience that the 2016 election in many ways gave voice and gave way to a venting of economic and empowerment anxiety, which also was on display, of course, in the Democratic primary challenge posed by the anti-establishment Senator Bernie Sanders. A resentment that sections of the country and classes of its citizens were being left behind, even laughed at, of anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim sentiment based largely on economic and security fears, of a sundering of journalistic norms and ethics in the new world of hyper-partisan social media, all which, along with other factors, including the obvious flaws of a highly experienced Democratic nominee who nonetheless captured a plurality of the popular vote, all of this led to this leap into the unknown, to the election of a political outsider and provocateur of whom so many Americans in the campaign's final weeks told pollsters they disapproved. Over the last month, we've continued to examine and explain the election to ourselves and to our partners around the world and here at home, because it's been made clear that our understanding of what motivates and matters to a great many of our fellow citizens is incomplete. And to be effective advocates going forward, we need to more fully understand these attitudes and concerns. For the most part, though, we're looking ahead, not back. Our mode is outreach and engagement. We have sought to assure that AJC continues to play its traditional and necessary role in the political process as an interlocutor with power, as a bridge builder, and as an advocate that can leverage our access and our credibility to advance the security and well-being of the Jewish people. Our utility to our people, to our country, to Israel, derives from our ability to be in the room, to interact with the forces that are shaping policy, to have the ear and the respect of decision makers. And our utility especially derives from our nonpartisan engagement in and the perception of our relevance to the American political process. The post-election guidance that AJC has offered our offices and our leaders around the country is severalfold. First, of course, we respect the democratic process. We know that whatever the peculiarities of the way we choose presidents or the peculiarities and transgressions of this particular campaign, the election is over. We celebrate our constitutional democracy and its guideposts for the peaceful transfer of power, and we are preparing to work with the new administration. Second, whoever is in power, whichever party or individual, AJC and our community as a whole must and will, I'm confident, defend our principles, defend our friends, defend ourselves. Third, to maintain our credibility and thus our ability to interact constructively with policymakers, we must conduct that defense of principles, including the principle of protecting the rights and the dignity of threatened minorities, with respect for those who hold differing views, with civility, with reason, and with courage. Now, the principles of political relevance and nonpartisan political outreach underlay AJC's very early contacts with the Trump campaign, even in those months when that candidate was not taken very seriously in the Republican Party. In fact, AJC reached out to all the presidential campaigns throughout the very long election season. Over the course of many months, my colleagues and I met with Trump policy advisors in Washington, New York, Chicago, even in Jerusalem. We featured Trump advisors as well as Trump surrogates in public policy forums that AJC conducted each day of the Republican National Convention in Cleveland. And on the sidelines of the convention, we also met privately with the campaign's senior policy advisor. We provided the campaign with position papers on domestic and foreign policy concerns, and we have continued to provide policy input. And we've also helped connect the transition team to some of our international contacts, a number of whom have approached us for assistance with access to a circle of advisors with whom many are unfamiliar. I must tell you that the latest of our private meetings with those who will fill out the new administration occurred just this afternoon in our New York office. While we are deepening our contacts and introducing ourselves to the individuals who will be crafting U.S. policy in the coming years, and while we are being circumspect in our public comments on Trump and his advisors, in the knowledge that his is the administration with which we will be working come January 20th, we have nevertheless spoken out when threats have come to light. We raised alarms about the alt-right movement when its neo-Nazi leaders had their appalling post-election meeting in Washington, and we called on Donald Trump to denounce them. We've shot down the Muslim registry concept, a pernicious proposal embraced by some in the Trump circle. Last week, we published a column in a Washington newspaper defending as vital to America and our allies and trading partners the carefully negotiated 12-nation Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the President-elect has decided to discard. Where we see racism and division and a walking away from allies, we speak out sharply. Please allow me to spend a moment describing what we're watching for as we approach the inauguration next month of a president-elect who, in unparalleled ways, is a political and policy question mark. First, the continuing run of White House and cabinet-level appointments. Appointments provide a test of the ideological purity of the coming Trump administration, as well as the value of governmental know-how. In the appointment of Reince Priebus as White House Chief of Staff and General James Mattis as Defense Secretary, for instance, pragmatism and experience appeared to win out. This may or may not become a pattern. Second, the ongoing outreach to foreign leaders and what we can discern of Donald Trump's chemistry with friends as well as with potential adversaries. Some of the early signs have been unorthodox and likely unscripted, including his phone calls with the President of the Philippines, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, and the President of Taiwan. Needless to say, we'll want to pay especially close attention to his contacts with President Putin, as well as with the leaders of the NATO frontline states, especially the vulnerable Baltic states. We should also be looking for signs of continued warmth not only toward Prime Minister Netanyahu, for whom he has expressed admiration, but also toward Egyptian President Sisi, who is desperate for a friend in the White House after roughly 4 chilly years, and with whom Trump met in New York in September. Third, we're looking at outreach to the bruised constituencies in the United States. Will there be further moderation of the Muslim ban and immigrant deportation calls from the campaign, and perhaps a demonstration of distance from the hate-filled alt-right that throughout the campaign provided outlets for racism and anti-Semitism? Will he continue his outreach to the LGBTQ community, which he demonstrated at various points in the campaign and marks a striking departure for the Republican Party, but represents a more cosmopolitan worldview appealing especially to younger voters? We and our civil society allies are engaging, and we are awaiting answers. Fourth, we will be watching for signs of policy inclination on several foreign policy fronts. Will he seek to weaken sanctions against Russia, either by urging the European Union to ease up in its next scheduled sanctions renewal, or finding other ways to demonstrate U.S. openness to Moscow and thereby hollow out support for continued sanctions? Will he adopt a more muscular stance toward Iran? And how will that affect his presumed intention to cooperate more closely with Iran's ally, Russia? Will he, in fact, pull out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which AJC opposed when it was before Congress last year, but which we are not convinced will advance American and allied interests now to unilaterally abandon? At any rate, tearing up the JCPOA is a proposition more easily stated than accomplished. What we seek instead is the strictest possible enforcement of the Iran deal and the imposition of severe sanctions and other punitive steps in response to a range of destabilizing Iranian activities and behaviors, including in Yemen, and including Iran's provocative behavior toward U.S. naval vessels and its development of advanced ballistic missiles. We are engaging Trump advisors on this front, and we will be watching closely. Will Donald Trump make good on a campaign promise that every other recent president has made and then broken to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem? In the same vein, will he alter long-standing bipartisan U.S. policy supporting a negotiated two-state resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and viewing West Bank settlement expansion as an obstacle to peace? Will he impose new restrictions on the granting of U.S. visas for citizens of Muslim-majority countries, a step likely to feed the very sort of anti-American and anti-West anger and alienation so effectively exploited by ISIS? Will he take any of his campaign-promised steps on the undocumented, beyond the removal of convicted criminals? Similarly, will he reverse the Obama effort to achieve a more balanced approach to Latin America, turning around the opening to Cuba, for instance, or moving forward with plans for the Mexican border wall? These questions of foreign policy in the Trump administration are of vital concern. And the fact is that at present, we and others in the policy community in the United States and around the world are grasping for clues. We have more than a year's worth of campaign rhetoric to go on, of course, revealing an inclination toward avoidance of entangling security commitments and foreign wars, a resentment of trade agreements that appear to leave the United States at a disadvantage, a commitment to making substantial investments in military hardware, and a very dark view of the Iran nuclear deal, of U.S. intelligence and military capabilities, of the reliability of allies, of the value of the European Union, of the wisdom of NATO strategy, of Saudi and Japanese and Korean dependence on the U.S. defense umbrella, of Chinese monetary and trade policies, and an admiration for strong leadership, in particular that of Vladimir Putin. We also know of his and his family's sincere affection for Israel and his desire to help advance a peace agreement that would assure Israel's long-term security. What this adds up to is less a coherent foreign policy vision than a sense that the United States is on a losing streak, economically, politically, strategically, and that the Trump administration's core commitment, the fulfillment of its promise to the American people, will be to reverse that dynamic, to win against our enemies, to race past our rivals, to prevail against the forces of globalization, to disrupt the old order and chart a new way forward. Yes, it is a tall order. I think we should keep in mind that expecting a coherent foreign policy vision from any new administration, particularly from a president with no political or policy experience, is probably expecting too much. What we must watch for is the translation of Donald Trump's sentiments, the resentment and anxieties and aspirations that he expressed, into government programs, into budgets, into diplomatic exchanges, into policy. This we will be watching very closely. And one final word on the election, and for those who were dismayed, to use the mildest possible description by some of the rhetoric and accusations and falsehoods of the winning campaign for president, I urge you to remember that campaigning and governing are not the same thing. We have a right to expect better, and better has precedent. Donald Trump will by no means be the first president who abandons or radically modifies stances that he took during his campaign. If indeed that is the direction, a center-right rather than a radical right direction that he decides to take. But for now, we can only speculate and hope that he decides, and draw deductions from some of the clues that I cited earlier. I do not at all think it would be wise to assume that the Trump administration won't represent a sharp departure in policy and tone in key areas. Unlike any other incoming administration in my lifetime, the words movement and revolutionary are often used in describing the force that has now begun assuming the mantle of American governance. Without a doubt, we're in for a period of volatility. As this process goes forward, AJC, I assure you, will keep our head, we will keep our cool, we will watch the players and the policies closely, we will look for openings to inject ideas and exert influence. We will remain steadfast in our principles, as well as open-minded and nonpartisan. We will continue reaching out to our Latino, Muslim, Asian American, African American, and other civil society partners across America, and to our friends and allies abroad. And of course, we will continue to rely on the guidance and the activism and the access of our community, of your support. And thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Certainly.
Okay, so we're going to open it up to questions and answers. Hopefully you'll have the questions and Jason will have the answers.
So I'm wondering, is AJC, have you seen a rise in anti-Semitism during this volatile period?
The elements of anti-Semitism that we saw among a number of supporters who were connected, not by any means, I don't mean to suggest in any means authorized by the campaign or speaking for the campaign, but nevertheless were very prominent among supporters and sometimes showed up at rallies with the most hideous and offensive signs and certainly tweeted and put out all kinds of statements that I think took our breath away too many times and should have been rejected more often than they were. When given a chance, the president-elect did denounce, but it would have been, we called for, and I know that others called for as well, more outspoken rejections of this element of American society, an ugly strain that has never ceased to exist and that was given air and space in this campaign. I'm hoping and expecting, frankly, that we will see more clear-eyed, full-throated renunciation of this element. We saw it to some degree after this alt-right display in Washington. I would like to see more. We need to see more. The country needs to see more. Our community needs to see more. Will AJC be watching this closely? You bet. You bet. There are people who have sometimes, as I think you know, said that, look out. We're going through a period that we've gone through in this country in the past. I'm not ready to say that, but we are watching very closely. There are certainly danger signs, and there's an element that has been empowered, and they need to be pushed back into their hole.
When a new and clearly more friendly administration is coming to power, when the Middle East is engulfed in a war that has nothing to do with Israel, And when many Arab countries have drawn closer in their strategic assessments to Israel, and I could go on, but isn't that the very time when Israel should be willing to try to move forward and maybe even make some sacrifices here?
The Palestinians are as weak as they've ever been, yes. They're divided politically, aside from geographically. The legitimacy of President Abbas is a question. The succession of President Abbas is a question. Support for the Palestinian cause in a number of other states, it's not high on the agenda. I've just traveled to the Gulf with AJC colleagues 3 weeks ago, met with many, actually it was just before the election, so it was 4 weeks ago. We came back just before the election. Met with many leaders in the Arabian Gulf, and you had to plow through a very long conversation before we ever came to Israel and Palestine. We know the difficulties that the Palestinians face internally. We know the political difficulties within Israel as well, within the Israeli coalition. Whether given those two almost impossible to reconcile political entities, both of which have constituencies that want peace, but both of which are fearful of the compromises or reject the compromise that will be necessary to make peace, how we get past this current paralysis is a very difficult path. You know, the fact that the Palestinians are weak doesn't necessarily mean that they're more ready to compromise. One could say the opposite. One could say that a weak Palestinian leadership, fearful of the reaction of its people to any kind of compromise beyond the huge promises that have been made to them, the lies that have been delivered to them for decades, will be impossible for President Abbas or President Abbas's successor. Does it mean we shouldn't continue to push for some kind of movement toward accommodation, some kind of increasing economic interaction, some kind of increasing civil society interaction between the two parties so that we develop some kind of trust that builds the basis for compromise, for reconciliation? I believe that we have to do that. So if your question is, are we at a point now where we can try to make some progress because of the weakness of the Palestinians, I would say not necessarily for that reason. I would say that for the reason that the longer this lasts, the more difficult it will be to ever reach a compromise, the more difficult it will be to separate the two peoples. And so for that purpose, for that reason, we do need to not lose sight of the possibility of moving forward. I do not expect an Israeli-Palestinian agreement anytime soon. I do not expect a two-state solution anytime soon. That's just the reality, given the politics on both sides. But we cannot give up the vision of a two-state solution, and I think we should, and I think the Trump administration, I hope that the Trump administration will pursue a path toward trying to move in that direction, working closely with our Israeli allies, but also not forgetting the fact that the millions of Palestinians also need to see some hope of a better future. Frankly, to assure peace for the people of Israel as well as for the people of throughout the region.
You mentioned the Baltics before, and are there fears in the Baltics that Putin might invade and that Trump, in his efforts to ally himself with Putin, might look the other way when another president might not have gotten into such a situation?
I mean, the reason that NATO has dispatched troops to the Baltic states to provide some reassurance to our northeastern NATO allies is for the fear that Putin will take a lesson from his ability to snatch Crimea and to meddle in eastern Ukraine. I'm hoping that the very uncertain signals that we heard from President-elect Trump in the course of the campaign about the reality of the Russian aggression in Ukraine and the reality of the Russian takeover of Crimea he understands, and he will stand with our NATO allies and with the extremely vulnerable Baltic states especially, to stand against that kind of aggression. How he will do that, I do not know. As you know, very uncertain signals were given, questioning just the facts of Russia's involvement in Ukraine. Part of a kind of an ongoing, quite disturbing trend of not believing facts, which is a whole other topic that maybe can occupy another evening in this sanctuary. But it's, I believe that there will be enough experienced, wise, knowledgeable people surrounding the administration who will recognize, as has traditionally been American policy, that confronting aggression there defends our interests here and defends our allies everywhere. The United States has to stand against aggression, has to stand against invasion of sovereign territory. I expect that that will be the case going forward.
You mentioned about tolerance. I don't know what the AJC saw in the recent environmental conference in Morocco. There was quite a hot demonstration against Israel, violent in a sense. And Morocco is supposed to be friendly to Israel.
I've spent a lot of time in Morocco. I think there are probably others in this room who have done so as well. Is Morocco, for the most part, a country that defends its Jewish community? Yes. Is it a king who has provided protection to a Jewish community? Yes, he very definitely has. Has he occasionally given signs of openness toward Israel, receiving an Israeli foreign minister and in other ways seeking to encourage Israeli-Palestinian peace? Yes, he has. Are there elements within the Moroccan political space that are anti-Israel, anti-Western, even violent? Yes. It's a very mixed scenario in Morocco, as I think you know. It's a country that is more pro-American than many countries in the region. Very long history of very positive relations between the United States and Morocco. I think it's a magnificent country. But are there elements in the country that that need to be more sharply, decisively opposed by the rulers? Yes, it's the case. It's a country that has tried a different formula in the Arab Spring to incorporate different elements within the political process to empower, actually, of a so-called moderate Islamic party, or Islamist party, the PJD, and to keep it under certain constraints, but to allow it to operate and to grow. I have to also tell you that there were candidates who were running in the last parliamentary election who were violently anti-Jewish on record, who were suddenly kind of removed from the ballots just before the election by order of the government. So it's a complicated dynamic. Yes, there are some elements that rise up and that need to be shot down, but I wouldn't by any means write off the country whatsoever. It's for the most part a good friend. Yes.
Jason, what is the AJC's position on the relocation of the American embassy to Jerusalem? And can you handicap the prospects for that occurring within the next 4 years?
A tough question. We have, of course, supported the self-evident notion that the capital of Israel is Jerusalem, and therefore embassies, including the American embassy, should be in Jerusalem. Whether it will happen in this administration, this coming administration, is a question. The president-elect has pushed in that direction, and people advising him have said that that's the direction they want to go. There are also realities that we have to understand of how this will be regarded universally, how it will be regarded in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, among America's allies. But the American embassy belongs in Jerusalem. We'll see how it plays out.
A few weeks ago, AJC partnered with ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, which
Yes.
Has some ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. And I was surprised about that. Then I was even more surprised when a few days later, ISNA said they no longer partnered with you. And then every single time I've gone to their website, that partnership no longer exists on their website. But I've gone to your website several times, including a few hours ago, and that partnership is still there. So Can you tell us what's going on?
I'll try. Actually, we need to get Bob Silverman back here, who can answer these questions a little more accurately than I. Bob is our new U.S. Director for Muslim-Jewish Relations. We hired him away from the State Department earlier this year, and he is the mastermind behind the Muslim-Jewish Advisory Council. But it's something that AJC fully supports and is tremendously proud of. The fact is that we have millions of countrymen who have felt especially vulnerable in the last years, and with whom we have things that we can do together. By the way, not necessarily, not at all, not necessarily, specifically not foreign policy considerations are on the agenda of the Muslim-Jewish Advisory Council. We're talking about domestic issues, about matters of discrimination, religious freedom, religious liberty, and basically freedom from being targeted and discriminated against in this country. Now, the partner organization that we chose to work with is a mainstream organization called the Islamic Society of North America. We have very carefully reviewed its record. We have very carefully reviewed the people who are involved in ISNA. We know the current leadership of ISNA. We also, of course, know a great deal about its history. We are quite satisfied that these are worthy, honorable partners of AJC. There are people in our community, and believe me, people in the Muslim communities of the United States who are uncomfortable with the notion of Muslims and Jews working together and can drag up from old archives, press releases and speeches and various comments that have been made to the press in our community and in that community that can give grounds for opposing such a partnership. But we are confident that the leadership of our community and the leadership of that community can work together to solve common problems. We may have very significant differences in a number of policy areas, and we do. But on matters of working with our fellow Muslim citizens on issues of discrimination and tolerance and pluralism, we have a lot that we can do together, and we want to work closely with that community.
Ultimately, I wanted to know, what is the position of the Arab leaders towards Trump? I know we've mentioned certain Arab states. They are just as confused as everybody else, from what I can see, as to how to evaluate Mr. Trump. So I was wondering if you could give us some idea from your own analysis as to what the leaders of the Arab states are thinking, or how do they regard Mr. Trump?
I will go back to the last weeks of the campaign in some of the conversations that we had then, and then project forward. What we found in the last weeks of the campaign was, while you might expect that leaders of Arab states would be offended by anti-Muslim sentiments expressed by the candidate, or especially some of the people around the candidate, including the appointee for a national security advisor, statements that could be regarded as anti-Muslim, let's say. While you think that might offend or cause them to feel that this is not the man they want in charge, or the individual they want in charge in the White House, in fact, the greater concern that we were hearing had to do with Iran's threat to the region and who would stand up to that threat. A feeling that perhaps if a Hillary Clinton presidency were in many policy areas a continuation of the Obama presidency, you would have kind of a winking at certain aspects of Iranian aggression, an openness to Iran that would be to their detriment. And they feared that more than they were offended by the sentiments of the Republican candidate. There was also a feeling about the Muslim Brotherhood, because while there is great fear and antipathy directed at Iran, there's also the same sentiments directed against extremist forms of Islam, and especially the Muslim Brotherhood. And a sense that Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, in the eyes of some in the Gulf especially, and also in Cairo, provided openings to the Muslim Brotherhood and had a certain, maybe a weakness toward considering them a necessary part of the political environment in ways that these Gulf leaders and the Egyptian president and the people around him feel is not legitimate. And so for those policy reasons, there was a feeling that perhaps something other than Clinton would be preferable. I can't say that I came away with feelings of strong, warm support for Donald Trump, because there was a huge question over who he is and what he stands for. And I believe that a lot of those questions remain, but there was also, I have to be honest, a great feeling of concern about a Clinton presidency among certain Arab leaders with whom I spoke. So I think they're questioning this and trying to figure it out the way so many people are around the world.
We've heard about the influence of the alt-right and their anti-Semitic ravings influencing the Trump administration. I wonder if conversely you could actually talk about the Jewish appointments to his cabinet and the influence of Jewish advisors within his close group of people. I also wonder if you could prognosticate on President-elect Trump's adherence to a sustainable support of Israeli security vis-a-vis adherence to the Memorandum of Understanding regarding military aid over the next 10 years, and also Iron Dome and other issues of Israeli security.
I mean, I expect no lessening whatsoever of the U.S. support for Israel's security at a time when we will have a president who may, by some indications that we've gotten in the course of the last year, not be so keen on expanding the U.S. role as a provider of aid to friends and allies around the world. I am convinced that this will be an administration that is fully supportive of Israel's security needs, will at least meet, if not exceed, what is provided for in the 10-year MOU that was signed by President Obama, or by the Obama administration. I think you also make an important point about the fact that there are Jewish advisors to and appointees of President-elect Trump. So yes, there are, not to mention the fact that this will be the first president with Jewish grandchildren, which is quite remarkable. So are there important Jewish connections that this president-elect has? Absolutely. Are there supporters of his in the course of the campaign who are anti-Semites? Yes, that is the horrible reality of modern America. Would I like to see a firmer rejection of that? Yes. Do I believe that it influences the thinking of President-elect Trump? No, I don't. But I want to see it renounced because it's important for American society and for our people and for the good of our country for that kind of declaration to be constantly made. But I have no fear whatsoever that this is a man who is influenced by anti-Semitism. The evidence is just simply not there, and in fact, quite the opposite.
What about the Jewish appointments?
Well, that's. I mean, there have been cabinet appointments and some White House appointments, and I expect we'll see more of that. And certainly, someone whom we know is of enormous importance in the Trump circle is his son-in-law, and lawyers who have worked for the Trump organization. It's a long list, actually, and I expect we'll continue to see these names coming forward.
What are your feelings about the Iran deal and Trump's intention of repealing that? What are the ramifications of that if that does go into effect? And what are the ramifications of it as it exists?
AJC opposed the Iran deal, not because we didn't think it was well-intentioned, not because we didn't think that President Obama was trying to do something that would be in the best interest of the United States and our allies, including Israel. It delays rather than ends the Iranian nuclear threat. And in how it is being enforced or how it has colored American policy toward Iran, it has led to a kind of a lessening of necessary American reaction to Iranian misbehavior. I hope in the new administration we will see a reversal of that aspect of U.S. policy toward Iran. I do not expect a tearing up or a walking away from a deal. I expect very tough implementation of the deal. It's not so easy to walk away from something that's been adopted by the UN Security Council and all of America's allies. And for us to unilaterally walk away from it would have all kinds of implications. It wouldn't necessarily do anything to slow down the Iranian nuclear program. And we would not have the support of the international community in reimposing sanctions. We've gone the unilateral sanctions route in the past. It didn't do the job. We need to have international support for effective sanctions against Iran. Or we could have war. So the better course, I believe, is to stick with a flawed deal, but impose very tough standards and very tough sanctions as required on other aspects of Iranian behavior. Its missile development, its threats to its neighbors, its the subversion that it sponsors in Yemen, in Bahrain, in other countries, its support for Hezbollah. You know, AJC has led a campaign to have the European Union fully designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. 3 years ago, they took a halfway step, important step, and designated the so-called military wing of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. It's a fiction. There's no such thing as a military wing. Hezbollah is a unified organization. We want to see the European Union fully designate Hezbollah as a terrorist entity. It will hurt Iran's influence by doing so. We want to see that carried forward. We hope the administration will work with us in that regard. So there are a number of steps that I'm hopeful that the Trump administration will take. I don't think that it would be wise, and I don't think it's even so possible to just simply tear up an agreement.
The probable new chairman of the DNC is going to be Keith Ellison. Keith Ellison, for people who don't know, voted against the Iron Dome, was a supporter of Louis Farrakhan, was very critical of United States aid to Israel. He's changed his tune a little bit recently, but it's very, very hard to believe. So on the other end of the spectrum, there's a serious issue also, and I want to know what AJC's position is on his likely becoming chairman of the DNC.
Are we concerned about a drift in the Democratic Party as we see evident in this room concerns expressed about the other party? Yeah, we are. Are we concerned about the possibility that a shift in a direction by the Democrats toward candidates and individuals, candidates and forces that are opposed to the security of Israel, want to have the United States pressure Israel in ways that will disserve Israel's security needs? Yeah, I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about progressive elements with whom we ally on a number of other issues moving in a different direction on Israel. And that's why we have reached out so affirmatively to a number of our coalition partners in various communities where this is a problem. And we're trying to arrest that problem through trips to Israel under Project Interchange of AJC, through other forms of outreach, through working together on some common concerns and hoping that we can therefore gain the kind of influence on their thinking on matters that relate to Israel's security that will be necessary for Israel's bipartisan support going forward. I don't want to comment on particular individuals, but I will say that we are concerned about the direction that both parties take on matters relating to Israel, and we're talking to a lot of people about that to make sure that the bipartisan support for Israel that has been so necessary for the U.S.-Israel relationship's universal appeal in our country to a remarkable degree, unlike any other country, where there is, not just in our community, but across the board, overwhelming support for this relationship and for the security of Israel. We want to make sure that that goes forward.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, To Jim, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.